Okay, thank you for the invitation, first of all. Today I'm not going to present a paper, but two. I have a joint project with José Ignacio García Pérez on the effects of the 2012 labor market reform on the Spanish labor market regarding both external and internal flexibility. So we have two papers on this issue. We have a paper that was already published in Labor Economics on the effects of reducing the severance cost gap, precisely, that was mentioning Marcel, and so regarding the external aspect. And in that context, we also compare with the effects of introducing a single contract. And in the paper that we are working right now, we are introducing the internal flexibility. We are allowing for short-time work policies. Okay, we think that using Spain as a benchmark is really interesting because in Spain, as everybody in the room already knows, there's a huge unemployment rate and the duality in the labor market is very high also. So let me start with the motivation. I was very lucky to have Marcel before me because he already mentioned many things, so I can skip them. But as you know, already, the Spanish labor market is one of the labor markets that have performed worst during the recent recession. Part of the reason has to do with institutional features. Regarding external flexibility, before the 2012 labor market reform, there was a large gap in severance cost. And regarding internal flexibility, hours and wages were very difficult to modify because they were set by collective agreements. So these features imply that during the recession, I'm sorry, yeah, okay, thank you. During the recession, and when the employment goes down, then wages didn't adjust. So they behave, as you can see here, countercyclically. And only after the 2012 labor market reform, wages started to adjust. Because firms used these temporary contracts to adjust, basically. They couldn't adjust using wages and hours before. So there is broad consensus among Spanish economists that something has to be done in order to fight against this duality in the labor market. All the reasons that I have mentioned here, they were already mentioned by Marcel and others in the room. So I'm not going to go into the details. Let me go to the objective that we want to accomplish. We want to compute the effects, the explicit effects of allowing for more external and internal flexibility on unemployment, job destruction, and the tenure distribution. In particular, we will focus on the temporary job destruction rate and on the smoothness of the tenure distribution. And then we will compute the transition in order to see what's going on regarding welfare, the cost of the policies, and also to be able to talk about distributional issues. We're going to concentrate today on three policies: reducing the severance cost gap, introducing a single contract, and making available short-time work policies. Okay, the model, I'm not going to go into the details, but just to mention that the model that we are going to use is a job creation and destruction model of the search and matching type, with some standard ingredients and some new ingredients that we introduce in order to capture the features of the Spanish labor market. We need a dual labor market with two types of contracts that differ in productivity, in the length of the contract, and in the associated severance cost. We also need to have the job conversion decision endogenous. We model severance cost as a transfer from the firm to the worker. This transfer is going to be a function of wages and seniority. We need a downward wage rigidity in order not to have too much internalization. I was mentioning Pietro in the first talk. And one of the things that is very original is to model seniority, to have seniority as state variables, because this allows us to keep track of the contracts, the duration of the contracts. And these elements were already in the paper that was already published concerning the external adjustment. Now we are adding this possibility, the availability of short-time work, the possibility of reducing hours and wages. So we will have heterogeneous firms that will suffer temporary shocks, and they will be able to adjust either using permanent and temporary contracts or making use of the ability of short-time work. Okay, this graph should be familiar for you because Marcel had a similar one just before. So, but I think it's gonna be good to go over them a little bit quicker, but just to mention what's going on in the model. So in the model, we will have everybody's hired under a temporary contract, because as we already mentioned, more than 90% of the people are hired under a temporary contract. So typically, someone is hired under a temporary contract, and this contract can last for 2 or 3 years. In the model is 3 years. And after that, the firm has to decide whether to convert to promote the worker to a permanent contract or to dismiss the worker. Okay. Before the 2012 labor market reform, as Marcel was saying before, the gap was 45 days in permanent contracts and 8 days, only the blue bars I mentioned right now, and only 8 days in temporary contracts. What the 2012 labor market reform did was to narrow this gap. So now the severance cost gap is 33, the red one, 33 days wages per year of seniority versus 11 days in a temporary contract. So the gap has narrowed, of course. Job rotation here is much lower. I will show you the numbers later on. And the other possibilities are the ones that were mentioning already Marcel. Here I have 2 single contracts. You can define the single contract as you want. The first single contract is very similar to the reform. In fact, after the 4th year, the level of employment protection is the same, 33 days of wages per year of seniority. The only difference is this is the green bar. The only difference is that the indemnity in the first 3 years, instead of being 11 days per year seniority, increases in a gradual way. And only with this small change, we get larger effects on unemployment, job destruction, and the tenure distribution gets smoother. Of course, if you use a different single contract, like the single contract 2 here, which is the single contract that we call 1236, because the severance starts at 12 days and then increases by 2 additional days every year, then you get larger effects on unemployment and the tenure distribution. Okay, I wanted to show just 2 schemes in order so you have a sense of the order of magnitude of the effects. So let me go straight now to the results. This is the steady state. Here you have the variables, so unemployment in full-time equivalents, aggregate, temporary, and permanent job destruction, and 2 indicators of the tenure distribution. The proportion of people in contracts with a tenure equal to 1 or lower, and the proportion of people in contracts with a tenure greater than 3. And on the top, you have the first scenario, the status quo, where we have the gap, the 45 8 days of wages severance cost gap. Then you have the change introduced by the 2012 labor market reform, where the gap was narrowed. And then we have 3 scenarios with short-time work policy. The difference between these 3 scenarios is in the first one, firms have to pay full social security taxes, so they reduce hours and wages, but they have to pay full social security taxes. And in the other 2, they get a subsidy. I mean, they don't have to pay full social security taxes. In the second one, they pay only 67, and the last one, they pay proportional subsidies, proportional taxes. The last column shows the effects of the single contract. The very basic single contract that only differs from the EPL reform in the first 3 years. Okay, what you can see is that the sole reduction in the severance cost gap decreases the unemployment rate by 2 percentage points and decreases the aggregate job destruction rate basically as a composition effect. The temporary job destruction rate decreases and the permanent job destruction rate increases. Why is this decrease in the temporary job destruction rate? Because the gap has been narrowed and there is less turnover. At the end of the 3rd period, firms are less reluctant to convert temporary jobs into permanent ones. And of course, the permanent job destruction rate increases because now permanent jobs have become cheaper. With this change, the tenure distribution gets a bit smoother. I mean, I can show you a graph later. The blue bar is the situation in the status quo, so you have a lot of people here in very short durations and few people in longer durations, and with this change, you have less people in the first duration, and the tenure distribution gets smoother. What if we introduce now a short-time work policy? Okay, what you can see here is just adding a short-time work policy is not a guarantee of reducing the unemployment rate. You have to subsidize. So if you don't subsidize, if firms have to pay full Social Security taxes, nothing really happens. In fact, it's a bit worse because the same number of jobs, you have the same number of jobs, but some are part-time. So in full-time equivalents, unemployment rate here is a bit larger. So you need to subsidize in order to get better results in terms of the reduction in unemployment rate. As you can see, if you subsidize, you get 3 additional points. Job destruction rate decrease, and the tenure distribution gets smoother. Let me go to the graph. So this would be the green bar. So the tenure distribution gets a bit smoother. Okay, what is best? To have this scenario with a 67% subsidy or a proportional subsidy. Okay, at first sight, one could think, okay, the unemployment rate here is lower, but if you think a bit, if you look at it more carefully, then you can see that here in full-time equivalents you have a higher unemployment. This means that this reform induces more short-time jobs. So you have more jobs, but the number of hours worked is shorter. In the last column, you see the effects of introducing the single contract, the one that I mentioned before. Sorry, this one. The one that is depicted with the green bars. So this one. As you can see, the effects of the single contract are in between those of reducing the severance cost gap and those of introducing the short-time work policy. But of course, it's much cheaper. So with the statistic exercise, it's very difficult to give a policy recommendation. So that's why we did the transition in order to compute the welfare effects and the cost of the policies. And this is what I show next. We compute the transition, and we and we compute the equivalent variation in order to see the welfare effect of the policy, and also we compute the equivalent variation is expressed as an income annuity, and it's expressed in euros, and we also compute the fiscal cost of the policies, also expressed as an income annuity, in order to be able to compare. As you can see in the first 2 scenarios, the equivalent variation is negative. This means that people are willing to pay 105 years in this case and 164 in order to make the transition to the reform. In the first case, the fiscal balance increases, of course, because this reform is very cheap. In the second case, the fiscal balance decreases, but people could be taxed in order to make the reform plausible, and they still gain. In the 3 last cases, welfare decreases, but there are enough resources to compensate for the welfare decrease, so you could give them a subsidy. So all the reforms that I present here are Pareto improving. The first one, the best one in terms of the net effect, is the introduction of the basic single contract, the first one that I showed you before. We also wanted to see, okay, who wins and who loses, because there was a lot of opposition when before the 2012 labor market reform was introduced, there was a lot of opposition against the single contract. So it was, some people in the government talked about this as a plausible reform, but then in the end it wasn't introduced. So people were scared because they thought that introducing the single contract would reduce the average severance cost. So that's why we perform a winners and losers exercise to see who wins, who loses. So I know there are a lot of numbers in the table, but I just want to mention how this table should be read, okay? So, and give you a couple of ideas. Okay, here we have the transition from the status quo to the EPL, to the reduction in the severance cost gap. And here, for example, you have the exercise, the transition from the status quo to the short-time work policy, to one of them. We look at 3 different criteria in order to see who wins and who loses. The change in the indemnity, the change in tenure, and the change in income. So this, and here on the top, you have the changes for everybody, and then we disaggregate this by those who start the transition in a permanent contract, those who start the transition in a temporary contract, and those who start the transition as unemployed. Okay, so this number, for instance, would be, how can we read this number? This number, this 38%, would be the proportion of people who experience an increase in severance costs after the transition. And this number here would be the average number of days of the increase. So if you look at the table and you think about this, okay, severance cost is a tricky variable to look at. People want to know about this, whether the severance cost is going to increase or decrease, but it's tricky because you can have a higher severance cost at the end of the transition because because severance cost is higher, or just because you have been fired more times. Okay. The other variable that is a bit tricky is income, because you can have more income because wages are higher, but also because of unemployment benefits are higher, or because you receive more wage subsidies in a short-term work policy. So it's also tricky to look at this variable. We think that from the three that we have here, the best one to look at is tenure. Is tenure give us an idea of whether really people increases welfare or not, or at least they have a more stable trajectory. If you look at tenure, you can see that comparing this scenario with this one, for example, you have more people here improving than in the first place in the reform that was introduced. You have more people here improving, and almost the same people experience a decrease in tenure. But if you compare to the single contract, you have here, for example, this is the single contract 1236 that I mentioned before. You have a lot more people improving. This is 53, and only 3.7% are experiences a decrease in tenure. And if you look at those who improve more, in all the scenarios, the ones that improve more are the unemployed. And those are also the unemployed are those that are less jeopardized by the policy. So let me conclude. We find that the sole reduction in EPL decreases the unemployment rate in the steady state, the temporary job destruction rate, and smoothes the tenure distribution. We also find that adding short-term work policy decreases the unemployment and the job destruction rate substantially, but only if payroll taxes are subsidized. The effects of the single contract are similar, but it very much depends on how you design the single contract. The transition analysis shows that all the reform scenarios are Pareto improving. In those cases where welfare decreases, you can compensate because you have enough resources to do that. And as a policy implication, we think that the single contract is to be the best option to reduce the duality without significantly harming the budget, while the single contract, while the short-term work policy should be left as a strategy to use when there is a drastic decrease in employment and GDP as a way to preserve employment. Thank you.
Thank you very much.